At 78 years old, Elton John is more than just a musician. He is a cultural icon, a man whose songs defined generations, whose flamboyant performances changed what it meant to be a star, and whose voice gave the world some of its most unforgettable ballads. From Rocket Man to Tiny Dancer to Your Song, Elton's music became the soundtrack to millions of lives. But behind the glitter, the oversized glasses, and the endless standing ovations lies a story far darker than most fans realize. Elton John's life has been one of soaring triumphs, but also devastating tragedies, battles with addiction, heartbreaking betrayals, crippling health scares, and a childhood filled with loneliness that haunted him well into adulthood. Now, at 78, the reality of Elton John's life is even more heartbreaking. He has survived the kind of struggles that might have destroyed anyone else, and yet even in his moments of success, the pain never fully disappeared. From brushes with death, to the scars of his turbulent past, to the heartbreaking toll of time, Elton John's journey is a reminder that fame does not shield anyone from suffering. In this documentary, we uncover the tragedies that shaped Elton John's life, the ones hidden beneath the sequins and stadium lights. His rise to superstardom was dazzling, but his story is also one of deep personal battles, near collapse, and a search for redemption that came at the highest price. This is the true, heartbreaking tragedy of Elton John. Long before the world knew him as Elton John, he was Reginald Kenneth Dwight, a shy boy growing up in Pinner, a suburb of London. Born on March 25, 1947, to Stanley and Sheila Dwight, his childhood was far from the glamorous life he would later create. The boy who would one day captivate millions began life in a home filled with tension, distance, and emotional coldness. Elton often described his father, Stanley, as strict, detached, and unapproving. Stanley was a military man who valued discipline, order, and restraint. He wasn't cruel, but he was distant, a man incapable of giving his son the warmth and affection he so desperately craved. Sheila, Elton's mother, was the opposite. Outspoken, fiery, but not always nurturing. She could be unpredictable, sometimes supportive, sometimes critical, and often wrapped up in her own frustrations. As a child, Elton found himself caught between two worlds, ignored by his father, overwhelmed by his mother. He grew up believing he was never quite good enough, never fully loved for who he was. "I never got a hug," Elton would later admit. "I never heard the words, 'I love you' from my father." The emotional neglect left scars that would follow him for decades. But amidst this coldness, young Reginald discovered a lifeline: music. By the age of 4, he was playing piano by ear. At 11, he won a scholarship to the prestigious Royal Academy of Music in London. His gift was undeniable. The piano became not just an instrument, but a refuge, a place where he could pour all the emotions he could never express at home. Even so, his childhood remained painfully lonely. He spent hours in his small bedroom listening to rock and roll records, dreaming of a world far beyond suburban England. Friends were few, self-confidence even fewer. But behind those thick glasses and shy demeanor was a creative fire waiting to ignite. The turning point came when his parents divorced. His mother remarried a man named Fred Fairbrother, whom Elton affectionately called Durf. Unlike Stanley, Durf was supportive and kind, giving Elton the encouragement he had always longed for. But the emotional wounds from his early years never fully healed. The sense of rejection, of being unloved, would remain at the heart of Elton's insecurities, fueling both his drive for success and his later struggles with addiction and self-destruction. By his late teens, Elton was desperate to escape the suffocating limits of his upbringing. He began performing in local pubs, taking on odd musical jobs, and eventually joined a band called Bluesology. It was during this time that he would take the stage name Elton John, inspired by two fellow musicians, Elton Dean and Long John Baldry. It was more than just a name, it was a reinvention, a chance to leave behind Reginald Dwight, the lonely boy from Pinner, and step into the persona that would conquer the world. But even as Elton's career began to take shape, the insecurities from his childhood haunted him. He craved love and acceptance but feared rejection. He poured these conflicting emotions into his music, creating songs of longing, heartbreak, and fragile hope. His talent was undeniable, but behind every note was the echo of a boy who never felt truly loved. The tragedy of Elton John begins here, not in fame, not in addiction, but in the quiet, unseen heartbreak of his earliest years. His music would eventually bring him adoration from millions, but no applause could erase the pain of a childhood spent longing for the warmth that never came. By the late 1960s, Elton John's destiny was beginning to take shape. Meeting lyricist Bernie Taupin in 1967 would prove to be the most important partnership of his life. Bernie, a quiet poet from rural England, had a gift for words that perfectly matched Elton's genius for melody. Together, they created songs that felt timeless, simple yet profound, deeply emotional yet universally relatable. In 1970, with the release of Your Song, Elton John became an overnight sensation. The shy boy from Pinner, who once hid behind thick glasses, was suddenly a star. But it was only the beginning. Throughout the 1970s, Elton became one of the biggest acts in the world, releasing a string of hits that would define a generation. Rocket Man, Tiny Dancer, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Candle in the Wind. Each song seemed to capture a moment in time, a feeling, a universal truth that millions of fans clung to. Elton's concerts became legendary. Draped in glittering costumes, oversized glasses, and sequined capes, he wasn't just a musician, he was a showman. He made the piano the centerpiece of rock and roll, something no one had ever done before. Stadiums around the world sold out. Critics hailed him as a genius. By 1975, Elton John was, without question, the biggest pop star on earth. But beneath the dazzling exterior, the cracks were already forming. Fame, money, and adoration couldn't fill the void left by his lonely childhood. In fact, they seemed to make it worse. Elton began experimenting with alcohol, cocaine, and other drugs. At first, it was a way to keep up with the endless tours, the interviews, the pressure of always being Elton John. But soon, it spiraled out of control. By his own admission, Elton's life in the mid-70s was a blur of excess. He could spend days awake, fueled by cocaine, alcohol, and junk food binges, only to crash into deep depression afterward. His relationships suffered, his health deteriorated, and his insecurities deepened. He was adored by millions, yet inside he felt isolated and unloved. Part of the tragedy was his struggle with identity. In an era when homosexuality was still taboo in much of the world, Elton felt forced to hide his true self. In 1976, he gave an interview where he cautiously admitted to being bisexual. The reaction was mixed. Some fans supported him, but others turned away. Elton would later admit that the backlash only deepened his sense of shame and loneliness. At the same time, he struggled with self-image. Despite his fame, he hated the way he looked. He wore flamboyant costumes as armor, a way to distract the world from the insecure man underneath. Behind the stage persona was still Reginald Dwight, the boy who never felt loved enough, never felt handsome enough, never felt worthy enough. The late 70s saw Elton attempting to step back from the relentless pace of superstardom, but by then the damage was done. He was addicted, emotionally fragile, and searching for something, anything, that could give him the love and peace he had always craved. Looking back, Elton has described this period as both the pinnacle and the downfall of his life. He had everything he thought he wanted: fame, money, success beyond his wildest dreams. And yet he was miserable. The more he achieved, the emptier he felt. The tragedy of Elton John's story is that even at the height of his glory, when he was adored by millions, when he was selling out stadiums, when his songs topped the charts worldwide, he was already falling apart inside. The Rocket Man had soared higher than anyone could have imagined, but in the process, he had lit a fire that threatened to consume him completely. By the dawn of the 1980s, Elton John was already a legend. He had cemented his place as one of the greatest musicians in history. But behind the curtain of fame, his private life was spiraling into chaos. This was the decade when his addictions, his insecurities, and his inner pain nearly destroyed him. Cocaine had gone from being a party drug to a daily crutch. Elton once admitted that his typical schedule involved staying awake for days on end, fueled by drugs and alcohol. He would binge eat to cope with his emotions, devouring enormous amounts of food, then force himself to vomit afterward. This cycle of addiction and bulimia nearly cost him his life. "I'd stay up for 3 days, smoke joints, drink a bottle of Johnny Walker, and then I'd binge and purge," he later revealed. "I was completely out of control. Even as he performed sold-out shows, the man on stage was a hollow reflection of himself. His voice sometimes faltered, his health visibly declined, and yet he kept going, desperate to maintain the image of Elton John, the superstar who could do no wrong. The pressure to always deliver, to always be larger than life, became unbearable. The loneliness of his childhood reared its head again. He sought love in destructive places, surrounding himself with people who often took advantage of him. Relationships crumbled, trust was betrayed, and through it all, Elton sank deeper into depression. Despite being one of the most famous and wealthy people on earth, he felt utterly alone. Perhaps the most tragic symbol of this period was his 1984 marriage to Renate Blauel, a German recording engineer. Though she was kind and supportive, Elton was not being honest with her or himself. At the time, he was still struggling with his sexuality, still afraid to fully live as a gay man in a judgmental world. The marriage was short-lived, ending in 1988, and Elton later admitted that it was never fair to either of them. He cared for Renate deeply, but he was living a lie, and the fallout left him even more broken. As the decade wore on, his health worsened. Years of substance abuse took their toll. Friends worried he would not survive much longer. He overdosed more than once, attempted suicide, and had close brushes with death. For all the crowds that screamed his name, for all the records sold, Elton was fighting a private battle he was losing. Professionally, he continued to release music, but even his art began to suffer under the weight of his demons. His once brilliant spark flickered, and critics noticed. The man who had defined the sound of the 1970s seemed lost in the excess and despair of the 1980s. The darkest moment came in 1987, when Elton underwent surgery to remove nodules on his vocal cords. Doctors warned him that his voice might never fully recover. For a man whose life revolved around singing, it was a terrifying wake-up call. But even then, he wasn't ready to face the truth about his addictions. He pushed forward, ignoring the warnings, masking his pain with more drugs, more food, more chaos. Looking back, Elton has admitted that he should not have survived the 1980s. Few people could endure what he put his body through, and yet he somehow did. But the man who emerged from that decade was broken, scarred and desperate for change. The tragedy of Elton John's darkest years is not just the near-death experiences or the addictions. It's that he carried all the pain of his childhood and the pressures of fame alone, without truly letting anyone in. He was a man adored by millions, yet he lived those years consumed by emptiness. The 1980s nearly destroyed Elton John, but out of this darkness, he would begin, slowly, painfully, to seek the light again. The 1990s marked a turning point in Elton John's life. After decades of addiction, heartbreak, and self-destruction, Elton finally realized that he could not go on living this way. In 1990, he checked himself into rehab, beginning a long, grueling journey of recovery. For the first time since his teenage years, Elton faced the world sober. It wasn't easy. He had to confront the pain he had buried beneath drugs and alcohol. He had to face the demons of his childhood and the wreckage of broken relationships. But with the support of close friends and his unbreakable bond with Bernie Taupin, Elton began to rebuild. He embraced honesty, self-acceptance, and eventually, forgiveness. Then in 1991, tragedy struck the world. The AIDS epidemic had devastated countless lives, and Elton lost many dear friends to the disease. Among them was Ryan White, a teenager who became a symbol of courage in the face of AIDS discrimination. Elton had befriended Ryan, and his death at just 18 deeply shook him. It was a turning point. Elton realized that he could use his fame and resources to make a difference. In 1992, he founded the Elton John AIDS Foundation, which would go on to raise hundreds of millions of dollars for research, prevention, and care. For Elton, this work wasn't just philanthropy. It was redemption. It gave his life new meaning and allowed him to honor those he had lost. The mid-1990s also brought one of his most powerful moments. His performance of Candle in the Wind 1997 at Princess Diana's funeral. Diana had been a close friend, one of the few people who truly understood his struggles. Singing that song in front of the world, Elton turned grief into art once again. The single became the best-selling of all time, a haunting tribute to a life cut short. On a personal level, Elton finally found the love he had always craved. In the early 1990s, he began a relationship with David Furnish, a Canadian filmmaker. Unlike past relationships, this one was rooted in honesty, trust, and mutual support. In 2005, they entered into a civil partnership, and when same-sex marriage was legalized in the UK, they wed in 2014. Together, they adopted 2 sons, Zachary and Elijah, giving Elton the family he had long dreamed of. But even as Elton's personal life blossomed, his health struggles grew more severe. Decades of abuse had taken their toll. He suffered seizures, battled infections, underwent multiple surgeries, and even came close to death in 2017 from a rare bacterial infection. Each time he fought back. But the reality was clear. The years of excess had left scars that time could not erase. In 2018, Elton announced his farewell tour. Farewell Yellow Brick Road. It was his way of saying goodbye to life on the road after more than 50 years. The tour, filled with emotion and spectacle, became one of the highest grossing in history. Fans around the world flocked to see him one last time, to say thank you, to celebrate not just his music but his survival, and yet, behind the applause and celebration, there is heartbreak. At 78, Elton John is a man who has lived through more pain than most can imagine. The tragedies of his childhood still echo in his soul. The scars of addiction remain etched in his body. The friends he lost to AIDS, the loved ones gone too soon, the years wasted in darkness. These weigh heavily on him. Even as he smiles for the cameras, the tragedy of Elton John at 78 is not that he failed, but that he endured so much suffering to get here. His story is triumphant, proof of resilience, recovery, and redemption. But it is also heartbreaking, a reminder of how fame can wound as much as it rewards, and how even the brightest stars carry shadows that never fully disappear.